Good evening, everyone. So nice to see so many of you have been here for the previous 3 weeks, and you're coming here for the 4th week, so it's so nice. Dr. Nimick and I were talking in Florence, and it's going to be a little bit of a lighter approach to the presentation this evening, not too cerebral or anything. He does engage the audience. I know that from whenever he joins the priests at our annual fall convocation. So do not be afraid to ask any questions. Dr. Paul Nimick comes to us as Director of Counseling Services for Catholic Charities, and I'll let you say whatever else you want about yourself, but it's a treat to have you here with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that okay if is that good? Okay. Thank you, Father Dave. Thank you, Florence, for your invitation. And, you know, whenever I go out to speak at parishes like this, you know, sometimes I go out there and I'm all ready to go. And I walk in and there are 5 people there. Now, I'm happy to be there for 5 people. I mean, that's good. God bless them. But it's really nice to see a group of people this size here. This is really remarkable. I was also telling Father Dave and Florence that in my capacity as counseling director at Charities, I do get around the diocese a little bit, not as much as I like to. I always enjoy coming out to parishes for events like this, but I have never been to this parish. I have never been here. So this is a first for me, you know. This is really cool. I'm really happy to be here. And I walked in and I was you know, never having been here. This church, this worship space, reminds me very much of one of the tiny little churches that we have, St. Mary's, up in Yatesboro in northern Armstrong County. And there was a tiny little country church. You know, the door was back there and the altar was up there, and whenever they renovated it, I don't know how many years ago, they tore it down to the studs, you know, and whenever they were done, the door was over there and the altar was over there. You know, it's just very much like this is here, and it's just really what I thought of whenever I walked in. Of course, this is much bigger, but nonetheless, it's really pretty good. Thanks for having me here. By the way, let me just say a couple of things before I get started here. I have my phone that I'm keeping here. I am not waiting for a more important text or something, you know, I'm not going to take pictures and like Instagram them or anything. I don't wear a watch, you know, so I'm just going to be looking at the clock periodically, okay? So if you see me pressing my phone, I'm just kind of trying to keep track of the time, okay? I hope that this evening's talk is going to be helpful to you. I understand I'm the last in 4, I believe there were 4 talks. And I do these kinds of things periodically around the parishes, and you'll find that I'm somewhat informal. I can guarantee you something. We're both going to learn a whole lot more if this is more of a conversation rather than a lecture, okay? I mean, so if you have questions or you want to make a comment or something or other about something that I'm saying or about something that somebody else says, please do not hesitate to do that. I teach at St. Vincent part-time. You don't want to be like my students who have to sit there and listen to me go on and on and on. But don't do that. It'll just be better if we have some conversation. Okay. So how's Lent been going for you? Meds are meds, as my grandmother used to say. Right? Meds are meds. You know, Lent is an interesting time to do these kinds of talks because, for me at least, because I walked into a parish one time last year, a couple of years ago. It was during Lent, and part of a series like this is. And I walked in, and the cookie table looked like it came from a wedding. You know, and I said to the pastor, "Does Lent not come here to this parish? You know, like what?" I mean, I appreciated it, don't get me wrong. The temptation was, well, you know, awful, but it's good to be here with you at this time. What are we gathered here to talk about this evening? Well, let me tell you what, let me read you what Florence sent me, and that was in the brochures, I guess, that have been around. It says, he's not heavy, he's my brother. I did not make that up, Florence did. But he's not heavy, he's my brother. Violence and suffering, the blurb goes, makes up a large part of our news reports. Are you overcome by the weight of the world's problems? How do we cope with violence and suffering without losing our faith? How do we cultivate an atmosphere of peace within ourselves, within our families, within our communities, and within our world? Any answers? Pray.
Pray, just try to so relax. Don't pay attention to us.
We're going to get to that. We are going to get to that. We're prayer and zoning. We'll get there. Yeah.
I say to myself, well, I don't see people crucified in the streets.
Well, not here. Not here. In other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, right? Yeah, not yet. Not yet. How do we do that? Well, that's a tall order. I was saying, if I had the answers to all of those questions, I would be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, and just to in case you're wondering, no, the Nobel Committee has not called, so I think we're probably fairly safe there. Okay. The goal here this evening, my goal here this evening, and I hope it's your goal this evening, is not to solve all the problems of the world. Not to solve all the problems in our families. It's not to solve all the problems in our neighborhoods or communities or anything like that. Our goal, my goal, is for us to talk together, to support one another as we try to survive and thrive even as Catholic Christians in relationship with Jesus in our troubled and very, very troubling world. Okay. So it's probably a lot less grandiose, I think, than trying to solve the problems of the world. Let me start with a quote from Pope Francis, one of my heroes. You're going to be hearing from a couple of my heroes tonight, but Pope Francis is one of them. And is there anybody who does not like this guy? I mean, you know, he's fantastic. I mean, atheists like this guy, you know, come on. This from Pope Francis. This was his Angelus address on December 4th of last year, 2014. Here's what he says. Here's a quote. Peace is not just the absence of war, but a general condition in which the human person is in harmony with himself, with nature, and with others. Nevertheless, silencing arms and stopping outbreaks of war remain the unavoidable conditions for embarking on a journey toward the attainment of peace in its different forms. I think of the conflicts that still cause bloodshed in too many regions of the planet, of tensions in families and communities. In how many families, communities, and even parish communities there is war, as well as the sharp divisions in our cities and towns between groups of different cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. We must convince ourselves that despite all appearances to the contrary, harmony is always possible at every level and in every situation. There is no future without proposals and projects for peace. There is no future without peace. I love that guy. You know, I mean, he's really good. We must, here's where I want to leave you with tonight. We must convince ourselves that despite all appearances to the contrary, harmony is always possible in every situation. That may sound somewhat far-fetched. How can we grasp this? I mean, how do we get our heads around this stuff? Well, you know, If you take a look at the broad topic of conflict, of suffering, of war, of difficulties, you know, on the planet, in the climate, in our families, in our parishes and communities and whatnot, there are a lot of different ways that we can consider the problem of conflict. A lot of different ways we can look at the absence of peace and what it is that we can do to try to restore peace. You can look at this, there are a number of different lenses that you can use. You know, you can use the lens of politics. You could use the lens of economics. You could use the lens of faith. You could use the lens of morality. There are probably dozens of other sort of lenses that you can use, you know, to kind of get a grasp on the sort of the complex realities in which we live. All of those are legitimate. You might not like politics too much, or you might not like economics too much, or you know, any of the other things that I mentioned. But they're legitimate, you know. But I'm not a politician. I am not a priest. I am not a philosopher. I am not an economist. I am a counselor. I'm a psychotherapist. And because I am a psychotherapist, and I hope, I didn't say this, but you know, I am Catholic. I hope I'm learning to be a disciple of Jesus. I tend to see the world from the perspective of relationships. Okay? Our relationships with one another, in our families, our relationships with one another in our parishes, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. We have relationships with one another in terms of our political subdivisions, our towns and our cities and our states and our countries. You know, we have a relationship to the planet. You know, the Pope is going to come out sometime this spring, I think it is, with an encyclical, this spring or summer, I forget, with an encyclical on the environment. Some people are already condemning it, you know, but you know, and I don't know what it's going to say. He didn't check with me about that. But the idea there is that we have a relationship even with nature, you know, even with nature. So that lens of relationships is, again, that's not the only way of looking at conflict, and that's not the only way of looking at the absence of peace. But that lens of relationships has some consequences, you know. One of the consequences of looking at life with a relational lens is that you immediately become aware of the problem of anxiety. Okay? Anxiety causes a lot of suffering on the planet. Anxiety causes a lot of discord in families, disunity in parishes. I'm not talking about necessarily clinical anxiety. I'm not talking about the kind of thing that, you know, you go to your doctor and get medicated for. I don't necessarily mean that. I'm talking about the fears and the upsets and the apprehensions that people have about being in relationship with one another, about dealing with one another, living together with one another, either in families or in parishes or in the broader social realm. Anxiety is part of any relationship. Psychologists will tell you, because any relationship between any two people is never perfect. It's never perfect. Okay? I mean, how many of us, no matter how madly in love you are with your spouse, no matter how madly in love you are with your children, how many of us ever 100% of the time, unfailingly and constantly meet one another's needs completely? Anybody? Yeah, I didn't think so. It rarely happens. And whenever that doesn't happen, which it never does, you know, whenever that doesn't happen, we start to worry about that sometimes a little bit. Did I say something to make her angry? You know, what's the matter with her now? You know, what's Father Dave thinking over there? You know, whenever he's sitting there. You know, you know, we all have, how many, at work, you know, at work, you know, Do you ever do everything 100% of the time, always accurately, the way that your boss wants you to or expects you to? No, you may be well-intentioned and try hard and do your absolute best, you know, but it doesn't always work out. It doesn't always work out. Okay? So whenever I'm talking about anxiety, I mean that kind of thing. We will never be able to meet one another's needs and expectations 100% of the time, ever. So let's bring that up to kind of what we're talking about, suffering in the world and conflict and war and all that stuff. We live in pretty anxious times. Makes you want to zone out, doesn't it? Yeah. We live in very anxious times, right? There are plenty of examples of the anxiety rampant on the planet today. You know, war, financial crises, terrorism. One of the things that worries me, kind of, you know, planes that disappear without a trace. You know, that's, you know, notwithstanding that there are, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of flights that are in the air every day, one that goes away without a trace that nobody can figure out. You know, it's there, right? And if any of you, I haven't been on a plane since that airliner disappeared last year. But I'm going to tell you what, whenever I get on a plane the next time, I'm going to think, well, I'm going to get back off, you know? And I don't have any problem flying. I mean, I'm okay with that. But, you know, like planes that just disappear. Home invasions, you know, climate out of control. Aren't you glad we're done with winter this year, you know? You know, there are all kinds of things that we can be concerned about. You can add your own. I just think that, you know, I have people come in for counseling, you know, oh, I'm really anxious about, you know, this, or I worry about that, or there's just with my kids here, and you know, it's like they come in. It's like sometimes some people come in and they're like there's something wrong with them for being anxious. I say, you know, if you're not anxious about some of the things that are going on the planet, either in your own home or elsewhere on the planet, do you live under a rock? I mean, you know, it's like it's hard to avoid some of this stuff. It's really hard to avoid some of this stuff. But we can't pay attention to everything. We can't pay attention to everything. That's a big deal. We're going to talk about attention, you know, in a little bit. That's a big deal. What we pay attention to matters. We live sometimes not only with these, you know, with terrorism and planes that disappear and that kind of stuff like that, but of course we live with conflict sometimes and discord in our families. You know, despite your best attempts, sometimes children divorce. You know, or despite everything that you've tried to do, sometimes after, you know, X number of years of marriage, however long it's been, you know, sometimes you still kind of go like this. I had a couple, God bless them, I wish I could bottle these people. I had this couple that came in for counseling some years ago, and they were both in their 80s. And I had never worked with anybody that old, you know. And it wasn't marital conflict that they were having. After you know, being that old, you wouldn't think that there would be that much marital conflict, and there wasn't. They were coming in because of some other circumstances in their family, which you know we kind of don't need to pay attention to. But I said to them, I said, you guys are, you know, 80, whatever their ages were, 80-something years. I said, how long have you guys been married? And you know, and she looks at him and smiles, and he looks at her and smiles, and she says, 63 years. And he, without missing a beat, he said, yep, and a few of them were even happy. She hit him with her purse, you know. She just, they were wonderful. I mean, it was really very, very good. But my point is, even at that point in their lives, they weren't immune from some difficulties that they had to deal with, some discord, some problem, really actually some major problems. In their families. Anxiety in relationships that are both global and local, you know, kind of the big picture and a little picture, you know, on the planet and in our families. Anxiety is essentially the same. You know, it's essentially the same. It's fearful. It's, you know, you become apprehensive about about the future, about some future unwelcome state. Is this plane going to stay up when I get on? I have this little ritual whenever I fly. I'm not afraid to fly. I have flown in single-engine little four-seater planes. I've flown in commercial jets. I've flown in helicopters. I've flown in hot air balloons. Okay, I'm not afraid to fly. It's real. I'm more afraid to be on a ladder than I am to fly. Okay, but every time I get into a plane, you walk up the jetway and you're walking in onto the door of the plane, then the jetway is up against the the side of the plane. I always kind of tap the side of the plane whenever I walk in, saying, "Hang together, baby, hang together. We need you to be there. If I'm going in, I want to be able to come out in one piece." Anxiety like that, though, is based on fear, and it's interesting whenever you apply that to families, because really, what do we have to be afraid of in our families? What, really? I can understand terrorism, I can understand 911. I can understand, big banks, ruining my retirement accounts. I can understand, I'm not happy with any of that stuff, but what do we have to be afraid of in our families, really? Losing a child. What else do we have to be afraid of in our families? I'm sorry? What kinds of expectations?
False expectations.
Such as? Give me an example.
Maybe they think that you could rise to a higher level than you're capable of. That happens a lot.
You bet it does. You bet it does. And it happens both, in my experience, it happens both ways. Parents to children and children to parents. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Children. What about in your marriages? And I don't want true confessions here, okay? But what about in your marriages? I'm afraid that if I do something, she's not going to love me anymore. I will have damaged this relationship, this marriage, in some way. I wish you could all see this. I'm a member of the Cathedral Parish in Greensburg, and we're involved in the Christ Life program right now. I don't know if you ever heard of Christ Life. But there's a video that was part of the session last week, or 2 weeks ago, called The Lump. And it's just this 10-minute little video. Have you ever seen that? The Lump?
That one I haven't seen. Where the story of Christ.
Oh, are you really? Oh, cool. Go for it. Do it. It's wonderful. Oh, it's absolutely great. We'll talk about that afterwards. But there's this video called The Lump. That's part of one of the teachings, and it's about this this parent and this kid reflecting on something bad that this kid did, And at the end of the video clip, it's about the father forgiving his son for what he did. And I mean it's not the father like God the Father. I mean this father of this old 4-year-old or something like that. And the end of the video says, "There is nothing that you can do that will make me love you less. There is nothing that you can do that will make me love you less." But sometimes in families, people don't believe that. I've been bad. I did something awful. I did something unforgivable. And even if you try to be good, even if you try to be loving, how many of us, I'll put my hand up first, how many of us try to do the best we can and keep falling back into the same crap time after time after time, day after day after day, right? Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, we all fail. There was a joke that we were talking about at Christ Life last week, or I think it was last week, where God is looking at the world. God is looking at the planet, and He sees that things are in terrible shape here, terrible shape. So He says, I need to find out really what's going on there. So He sends an angel down. He sends a female angel to heaven, from heaven, to kind of take a look at what's going on earth. This angel comes back to heaven and says to God, you know what? I'm sorry to report, the earth is really messed up. 95% of people don't pay attention to you. They don't love you. There's only 5% who are trying to live the way that you want them to live. And God was kind of disappointed by this. So He says, well, I believe the angel, but maybe I ought to have a second opinion. So he sends a male angel down to earth. And the male angel goes down to earth, looks around, comes back to God and says, you know, God, I hate to say this, but she was right. The earth is in terrible shape. Earth is, 95% of people are not paying attention to you and not trying to live well. Only 5% of the people on the planet are trying to follow your law. God was tremendously disappointed. Talk about being disappointed. God was tremendously disappointed and said, what am I going to do? I have to do something for these 5%. I know. I'm going to get that 5%. I'm going to send that 5% an email. I'm going to send that 5% an email just to encourage them, you know? You know what that email said? Oh, none of you got it either, huh? There, I thought it was just me. You know? It feels like 95% of the world has gone to hell. Does it not? Sometimes in our families, it feels like 95% of our families has gone to hell. Or it's on the way. And sometimes we don't seem to be able to do anything about that. But the Pope Francis said, we always have to believe that harmony is possible. Here's the trick. It's not just going to happen. It takes work. It takes work. Our topic tonight is how we can, learn to live with violence and conflict and all that stuff. I want to suggest to you, and I want to hear from you as well, please. I want to suggest to you some possible strategies to think about. Okay. I want to kind of divide this into two parts. So first, we're going to talk about what I call the global problem. Like what's going on out there in the planet. War and violence and terrorism and planes disappearing and banks, all that stuff. And then we'll talk about kind of the local stuff within our families. Okay. So let me ask you. What do you do to promote the kind of harmony that Pope Francis is talking about? Whenever you see on the news, and you read in the newspaper, or you go online and you read on the internet and whatever, all this horrible stuff that's going on.
I want to go back to the gentleman, and I didn't see who it was over there, but was talking about the false expectations. Mm-hmm. And tie that in with Pope Francis's Angelus quote that you began with, that idea of, I think the first harmony was we have to be in harmony with ourselves.
Yes.
And I think that's really where it begins, because with as many people that I meet through the course of a day or a week, and I'm sure you see the same thing, experience the same thing, there are so many people that are not at peace with themselves. I have a little bit of a music background, so if anyone, including Florence, would know, if the music is written this way, and I decide to change the F sharp to an E flat, we create disharmony. And sometimes I think that disharmony within our own lives is the result of we want to be in charge. And we forget what we're praying in the Lord's Prayer. He's the one who's in charge, and so often, and the people here have heard me say this, who is the grand architect? And if I was following the blueprints, and I said, well, you know what, I don't think the plumbing should go this way. The architect screwed up, let's do it this way. Something's going to go haywire later on in that building. And that's what we're doing with the blueprints that God gave us. We're trying to re-manipulate them, thinking we know better than Him, and we don't. And as a result, it boils down to we've got to be at peace with ourselves first before we can be at peace with other people. And when we are stirred up within ourselves, it only follows that we're going to cause discord in other lives around us.
Well, you're exactly right. That without that, the harmony has to flow out, not in. You know, I mean, it starts here. What is it, again, for right now, let's focus on the global aspect of things. What is it about the global perspective there that keeps us anxious? Well, you know, what keeps us internally not in harmony with ourselves? Well,
You can't do, constantly, you can't do anything about it.
With the world problems.
you can't do anything about it.
But at night, when I say my prayers, I always pray for peace, and I pray for the troops and that. That's the only thing you can do, because we have no control over it.
You know, I think from a Catholic perspective, you're mentioning a couple of really, really important things there. Number one, prayer, okay? And I would even say from a psychological perspective, you know, that's really important. The other piece to that is, and I think it's in line with what Father Dave is saying, in a way kind of recognizing your place. We're not in control. We want to be.
That's why the world is the way it is. Everybody wants to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
And even our government, they can't pass any legislation because there are people.
Well, yeah, and
Everybody wants to be the chief instead of the
yeah, and that conflict, that disunity, that disharmony. You know, we hear about that all the time, right? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Go turn on the television. And that's what I want to say. Zone out. Turn it off. Now, I'm not advocating people to be uninformed, okay? I mean, hopefully you're all voters and you need to be, you know, we need to have an informed citizenry and all that, you know, which is important. But at the same time, we don't understand, most people don't understand most of the time, how much that constant barrage of negativity infects us. I didn't say affects us, I said infects us, okay? It's very, very powerful. We have, this is going to be the only piece of academics that I'm going to get into tonight, okay? I promise you. We have psychologists and those who study the brain, neurologists and neuroscientists today, have been able to determine that our brains are wired such that we seem to possess what they've called the negativity bias. Have you ever heard of that before? The negativity bias. It doesn't mean that you're always looking at the glass half empty. That's not what it means. The negativity bias means that our brains are wired such that we're always kind of on the lookout for things that could harm us. Okay? Now, if you think about that, way back, back in the old Pleistocene era or something like that, having that kind of, if you weren't attentive to what was on the savannah around you, it was likely that you could be lunch. Okay? So our brains develop such that we're always scanning for hurt, for harm. We're always scanning for things that could impact us negatively in some way. It's called a negativity bias. Go turn on CNN whenever you go home tonight. Your negativity cup will be overflowing. Trust me. One of the ways that we have to deal with this is to turn it off, is to zone it out. The television, the internet, your iPad, your smartphone, who controls that? You or the device? Well, you're supposed to. A lot of people don't. A lot of people have it. I read a statistic someplace that said that if you have one of these little smartphones, and this is just an iPhone. In fact, it's a couple of models ago. If you have one of these in your pocket, okay, you have more information, more readily available to you about what's going on the planet than Bill Clinton had during the entire 8 years of his presidency.
Unless you have a lot of information
Well, yeah, right. That's not, oh, everything's on here. What's that commercial? Remember that commercial some time ago said, it was on the internet, it has to be right, you know? Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of garbage, you know, a lot of untruths on there, but it's information, it's there nonetheless. We are constantly exposed to this stuff, and really it's a matter of survival that we back off from that periodically, that we regulate the amount of information we're exposed to, because both in our, you know, cognitively and emotionally, we just can't handle it all. I mean, we just can't, it's not because we're weak or sinful or stupid or anything else like that. It's just, you know, we're up against the limits of what it is that we can manage. We're up against the limits of what we can do. Okay? So it's important to be able to step back from that a little bit. It's important to recognize that you know, I'm in control about whether I look at this or not, you know. I'm in control about whether I go home and turn on, you know, and sit there like this, you know. And I see some of you have done that, huh? Yeah. So I'm not the only guilty one here, okay? Yeah. And I'm not saying that you can't relax. I'm not saying any of that stuff. I'm saying that when you get to the point that you're nervous, that you're fearful, that you're anxious, that you're apprehensive about all kinds of things, you know, on the planet, it's probably time to take a look at that and to back off a little bit. The other thing about television is, and I'm not anti-technology or anything, I'm not saying that, but you know, the other thing about all that stuff is we take that all in passively, you know? You just kind of sit there, you know? You kind of zone, you know, after a while. The passive nature of that viewing like that is, over a long period of time, is really detrimental to our psychological and I would suggest spiritual health. Okay, it's harmful. Okay, it's harmful because we are human. We're supposed to be. We should be attentive to what's going on in the world around us, but we should not be overwhelmed by it. Okay, we're only one person. The other part that you mentioned that I want to point out is another, you know, sort of significant idea that is current in psychotherapy to date, and it's the idea of acceptance. You know, many of the things that I deal with people who come in for counseling are things that cannot be fixed. Someone comes in because they're grief-stricken because their parent died. Well, we can help people to work through the grief and integrate the grief in their lives, okay? And that's important, that's good, I mean, that's helpful, that's really important. We can't bring their parent back from the dead, you know? If you've been the victim of a violent crime, you know, or if you've suffered some kind of, you know, I don't know, some kind of serious, you know, job loss or some kind of serious financial reversal or something like that, you know, we can't, what do we do about that? Nothing. I mean, there's nothing to do for that in and of itself. We had a guy call us one time really angry. He had about, I don't know what it was, I don't remember, this was some years ago. He had like 7 or 8 DUIs, you know. He wasn't getting his license back until someplace in the middle of the 23rd century or something like that, you know. And he was angry because we wouldn't intercede for him to get his license back. Now, I don't know what he thought we were going to do or why he thought we would do it, but, you know, like, his license was removed. He wasn't getting a license back ever in his entire life, okay? There are some things that are just, you know, that are just unrealistic, that just can't happen. So whenever we're faced with those kinds of situations, psychologists have been promoting the idea of acceptance, okay? Now, let me clarify that. Acceptance, as I'm meaning it here and as it's used in psychotherapy, does not mean resignation. Because resignation is, oh, well, you know, well, it is. It's kind of hopeless, you know, it's kind of despairing. Acceptance isn't resignation. Acceptance is staring the reality squarely in the face, okay, and saying, I can do what I can do, and that's all I can do. And that's enough. That may not make things any better. That may not objectively change anything in anybody's life, okay? but it's part of restoring the harmony in ourselves. It's part of restoring harmony in ourselves. Just a couple of other quickly before we go on to the local piece of this. In addition to like turning off the TV and stuff like that, or like controlling, limiting your access, there are a couple of other things, items about that. You should, the 11 o'clock news. How many of you should watch the 11 o'clock news at night? Stop it. You should never watch the 11 o'clock news. No, really, think about it. You get late at night, typically before you're going to bed, right? You're watching the news, and what do you see on there? Daffodils and, birds chirping. You see murder and mayhem. Yeah. You see blood, and you see accidents, and you see people harming one another, and you see terrorism, and you see, and then, good night. You're going to sleep, right? It doesn't work that well. There are some research out there that says that really, about whatever your bedtime is, you should stop looking at stuff like this, anything electronic. Your phone, your television, your iPad, or your computer, anything, at least about 60 to 90 minutes before you go to bed. Okay? You will tend to sleep better. You will tend to sleep more soundly for longer through the night. It's there, just what the research out there is saying right now. So that just to keep that in mind. At the time of 9/11, and I'm sure that you all remember that as well as I do. You remember in the first few days, first week or so after 9/11, anytime you turned on the TV, that's all that you saw, right? And you saw the video loops, right, of the planes flying into the buildings again and again and again. It was like this was seared into our national consciousness. Horrific tragedy. At the time, shortly after 9/11, one of my other heroes, besides Pope Francis, Fred Rogers, put out a public service announcement for parents about their children. And he said in that PSA, one of the things we need to do is to limit children's exposure to those video loops, because young children, were not always clear about what was happening there, and as this video was being played day after day after day after day after day at that time, and again, I'm in no way minimizing the tragedy, but what Mr. Rogers was saying, that children who see that again and again and again and again and again don't understand the reality the way that we do, and they're thinking that planes are still flying into buildings, and buildings are still exploding and falling down, and people are being killed and that kind of stuff. I would suggest to you that the same thing happens to us, or something similar happens to us, with a steady diet of that kind of stuff. We see that suffering, we see that violence, whether it's petty criminality or whether it's planes flying into buildings. We see that again and again and again, and we start to lose the idea that we can create harmony in the world, because the world is going to hell. We lose that idea, and that's very, very difficult. I want to switch now for a few minutes. What we got? I want to switch for a couple of minutes to thinking about, we're talking about the suffering on kind of the global level. I want to switch to the local level now, in our families and neighborhoods and parishes and that kind of stuff. How many of you who are married love your spouses? How many of you who are married love your spouses? How many of you, no matter how much you love your spouses, would also like to choke them sometime? Yeah. The people we love the most are the people we'd most like to choke sometimes. Now, I don't mean that literally. We were at that Lenten talk, and Dr. Nieming said it's okay to choke you, so here we go. No, I'm not saying that. The feelings can be very, very powerful sometimes, right? We have expectations of others. We have expectations of other people. I have an expectation in my marriage, I have an anybody does, I have an expectation. I've been married for 33 years, they're almost 34 years. Don't tell my wife, I almost forgot, okay? And, you know, and everybody comes into marriages, just to use that for an example, with expectations not only about what marriage is supposed to be like, but like I have an expectation about what I'm supposed to be like as a husband. And I have an expectation about what my wife is supposed to be like as a wife. Those expectations may or may not match up with one another. She has her expectations of me, of being what a husband is supposed to be, and her expectations about what a wife is supposed to be. They may not match, or it's unlikely that they completely match like two puzzle pieces fitting together. Okay? I mean, they probably generally match, hopefully, but there's probably some rough edges. That's life, you know. That's just the way it goes. Nothing wrong with that. That's just kind of the way that it is. We have expectations sometimes of others that are ill-founded. Do you ever expect your spouse? As I've always said, my marriage would be absolutely picture perfect if only she would do everything that I tell her. How many of you felt the same way? If only he would do, I mean, you know, that's how it is. Completely unrealistic, and we can sit here and laugh about that, you know, a little bit, but a lot of people approach their marriages that way sometimes, or their family life, you know, their children. I had a woman call me this morning seeking counseling. She and her husband are both retired. They're in their 60s, and they've been married for no, he's 70 and she's 60 something or other. They've been married for 46 years, and they have a 40-something-year-old daughter who lives with them, and they are still continuing to support. And we just can't do this anymore. Drugs? No. Illicit sex? No. Is she working? Yeah. She have some kind of, you know, disability or something that requires care? No, no. So why are you doing that? You know, it's like, well, we feel like it's our responsibility to support her. She's 45 years old. Yeah, come on in, we'll talk about it, you know. But it's like what do you do about something like that? You know, there's the conflict is set up there with the expectation that I need to support my kids forever. And sometimes whenever I work with adult children, you know, like if this 45-year-old daughter would come in, one of my questions to them is, what are you going to do when your parents die? Because you're killing them, you know. It never gets to that point, but you know, but you ask that question because, you know, that's the root of a lot of conflict and a lot of disharmony. So what do we do about this stuff in our families? Well, I want to give you, I think, oh no, this is my second last quote for the evening. Okay, this one is scriptural. It's one of my favorite quotes in the New Testament because it tells us exactly how to build that harmony that Pope Francis says we need. Okay? This is from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, okay? 4th chapter. I love this. St. Paul writes this: never let evil talk pass your lips. Say only the good things men need to hear, things that will really help them. Do nothing to sadden the Holy Spirit, with whom you were sealed against the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, all passion and anger, harsh words, and malice of every kind. In place of these, be kind to one another, compassionate and mutually forgiving, just as God has forgiven you in Christ. Anybody need a little boost for the last couple of weeks of Lent? There it is. Okay? There it is. That's what we have to do, in my opinion. How do we cultivate kindness with one another? How do we cultivate compassion? The Dalai Lama, who I really admire a lot, the Dalai Lama said that the essence of compassion, the essence of living compassionately, is to understand that whenever you wake up in the morning, almost everybody else on the planet is doing exactly what you're doing. Waking up, getting ready to start your day, putting on your pants one leg at a time, taking care of your family, doing your work. Everybody on the planet, just about, pretty much. That's the essence of compassion. Can we cultivate that compassion? Can we cultivate that kindness with our families? It's very hard to do that sometimes. The reason why, one of the reasons why it's very hard to do that, I think, is that, you know, have you ever been in a dark room, you know, and you go outside and the sun, it's bright sunlight, and you walk around like this for a couple of minutes, you know, and then gradually, you know, your eyes adjust to the, you know, to the light, or conversely, if you come from light into a dark room or something like that. We tend to, psychologists call that process, it's called habituation. We get used to a certain level of stimuli, right? We get used to a certain level of in terms of interpersonal relationships, we get used to a certain level of interaction with one another. And we tend to, our brains tend to kind of short circuit that process a little bit. So that whenever, you know, whenever you live with someone for 34 years, or however long you live with someone, you're raising children for 20 or 25 years or 30 years or however long you're raising children, you know, your brain operates on a series of kind of shortcuts. You get used to it. And that's a good thing. Because if every time you woke up in the morning and the person next to you, like you had to reintroduce yourself to them, that's a problem, you know? That's a problem. So it's a good thing that we're like that. The bad part about that is we tend to gloss over what people need from us. People need our attention. Our family members need our love. Our parish needs our active involvement in whatever capacity that is. And you notice I'm using the word active, as opposed to what we were talking about earlier with the television and all that stuff about being passive. You know, it's active, active. Love is an active verb, you know. It's not something that you can, it's not something that you attain by default. It's really critically important that action be part of our lives with the people with whom we interact. Is that going to get rid of all the conflict on the planet? No. Is that going to get rid of all the conflict in our families? I don't think so. But it's probably a way to help. It's probably a way to help. You know, so often we, tell me if this happens to you. It happens to me a lot. Tell me if this happens to you. You ever find yourself just going through your day, whatever you're doing, you ever find yourself just going through your day kind of on default? You know what I mean by your default setting? You know, you're just kind of rolling from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, just, you know, whatever it is, you know. You're on autopilot, you know, you're just on default. You do that. I mean, and it happens to all of us all the time, and sometimes we're overwhelmed, and, you know, okay, nobody's a sinner, I mean, that's okay. But if that's the only, whenever someone, particularly in your family, or in your neighborhood, or in your parish, needs your attention, autopilot doesn't work. You know, default is not what you need. What you need is intention. I am going to be there for this person. I am going to put aside what I needed to do this evening and sit and listen to my wife complain about her day at work, or help my children with this, that, or the other thing, or I told you we're doing Christ Life at the Cathedral Parish, and the last summer, toward the end, summer, the pastoral associate there had been to a Christ Life retreat, and you know, I've been trying to gradually back out of a lot of commitments that I've had over the years, and she came up to me after Saturday evening Mass one evening last summer, and she said, "Oh, Paul," she said, Father Bandura and I, we went to this training, the Christ Life training, and we're going to get this started here, and we thought you'd be really good to help, you know? And here she's building this up, and I know she's going toward the ask, you know? And in my head, I'm backing out of everything that I've been doing, you know? I've been backing out of, I want to sit on some boards and, you know, just some other involvements in the community, and I'm just pulling back on some of that stuff. So in my head, I'm saying, gee, thanks, Sandy. I really appreciate your confidence in me. I have the whole speech planned in my head, you know? And whenever she says, would you do this? I said, Sandy, I would really love to. Thanks for asking me to do this. I am really honored that you, and the odd thing was, for me, really serious, I am not kidding about this. The odd thing was, like, part of my brain had the speech ready, and it was surprised by the other part of my brain that was saying, you know, yeah, we're going to do this. I truly believe it was the Holy Spirit. Either that or I'm crazy, and there might not be too much difference between the two of them sometimes. But I truly believe, I really mean this, I truly believe it was the Holy Spirit. But that's what I mean by being, that's an example of what I mean by being intentional. If the parish needs me, am I willing to be there? If my family needs me, my spouse needs me, my children need me, whatever, you know, like something at work needs me, am I willing to be there? Or do I find excuses? Do I have that part of my brain that, you know, that's like, well, no, thanks, I'm not doing it. You know, which way is it for you? You know, which way is it for you? I would suggest that some of that harmony that the Pope is after, that, you know, that Father Dave said has to come from inside, it's intentional. It's not just something that happens. You know, you have to build it. St. Paul's admonition to be kind to one another is not something that just happens. We have to be able to work at it. We have to be able to do it, to actively be there.
But there is a certain dichotomy here, though, in what you're saying, because I find in my life that being there for family, for friends, for church, also is a source of anxiety, because like you said, you're putting things aside that you could be doing, and as much as you know you're doing something good, it causes anxiety in your life. So, where do you...
Here's the other word to keep in mind.
Moderate.
Balance, moderation. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. See, you know this stuff. That's exactly right.
But I have the same kind of brain you do.
Oh, I'm sorry. You are in bed. You better go to confession. I mean, you know, you're real serious.
He doesn't have
No.
the experience that you had where I've been ready to say no, and somehow yes has come out. On rare occasions, no has come out, but more often than not, it's that yes.
Let me contextualize that example that I gave for you. Remember, one of the things that I said was I've been backing out of a lot of other things. I have been saying no to a lot of other, to a number of other things that I have been involved with, you know. And, you know, quite frankly, for me personally, part of that, I've always been I've been a member of the parish for 34 or 5 years or something. I've always done something, you know, I've always been active in some way or other. That's the one thing I want to continue. That was part of my decision. You know, that's the one thing I want to continue. As long as they'll have me in some way or other, that's the one thing I want to continue. Everything else I'm backing away from. So you're right, though. The point that you're making, I think, is exactly right. That, you know, you can just as easily get overwhelmed with stuff from your family and from church and whatever other commitments you want to have. You can just as easily get overwhelmed by that without some level of balance and moderation. Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, and that's part, being able to say that and being able to make those choices is part of the health. It's part of the harmony. You know? Yes, Father Day. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Yeah, Father Day.
So you're using the word moderation or backing out. Some years ago, and this might help you off, Nancy, some years ago when I was at St. Vincent's, I came across these small little paperback pamphlets that were called Be Good to Yourself Therapy. And depending on the different situations, we have to come to realize that as much as we try to be kind to other people, every now and then we've got to be kind to ourselves as well, because if we don't take care of ourselves, pretty soon we're not going to be able to take care of the others. So every now and then we do have to back out of it, as Dr. Paul is mentioning. Every now and then we do have to back out of it, if for no other reason, kind of like a mini retreat, if for no other reason, for your own personal sanity and health.
We could, 7:20. We could go for 3 or 4 more hours talking about being kind to ourselves, because we don't do that very well.
I think the dichotomy lies in that we are all raised on conditional love.
Absolutely.
Everything is conditional. We start with our children. When they're 2 or 3, they got to read faster,
Absolutely right.
better, be stronger, quicker, athletic. But then we go to church, and Christ's love is unconditional. So now we have conditional love and unconditional. And here we are in reality, and here we are in our beliefs. And sometimes it begins to develop guilt feelings at an early age.
You have nailed it. You have nailed it. I ask people who come to counseling a lot of times, and I'll ask you, I don't want to show of hands or anything, I'll ask you, who loves you completely, absolutely, unconditionally? He's the only one. We don't have too much of a human experience. Usually, we don't have too much of a human experience of unconditional love, even with our children.
I was lucky enough to be a principal, okay, so I talk to parents kindergarten day. And the first thing I tell parents, don't play games, mostly women, fathers have to come, they're working. But I tell them, don't play games with your child as you do with your husband. If you mow the grass, I'll love you more. I said, don't tell your kid to bring some seed that he's not good enough as anybody else can have. At an early age, and that's how we start to get this training into this guilt stuff by not living up to expectations.
I want you to come to my office tomorrow and give that speech to my boss, okay? Would you do that? That would be a good thing, yeah. You nailed it. It's exactly it. I mean, that's exactly part of it. We have a very, very difficult time, generally, we have a very difficult time expressing loving kindness to ourselves. We always push ourselves. We're never enough. We always fall short. We always trip. Something doesn't work out right. And you know what? All of that is true, because we're not perfect. Many of the meditative traditions, both in the East and in the West, make up, and I don't want to go far astray here, but they make a big deal out of what's called loving kindness meditation. Loving kindness prayer. It's in many traditions. It's real kind of secular expression is in Buddhist meditation, but every major religious system that we know of on the planet has some form of this. In Christianity, it's the tradition of centering prayer, if any of you are familiar with that. But it's part and parcel of any and all of those meditative practices. And that would take us way too far afield to get into that this evening. But it's really important to remember that we need to cultivate that harmony. We need to cultivate that kindness, with ourselves first, and with the people who are closest to us first. Are we going to fail? Yes. Are we going to get overextended sometimes? Absolutely. Are we going to? Is it going to feel a lot of times like it's not enough? You betcha. And we keep trying. We wake up again tomorrow morning, and we keep on doing it in love. We keep on doing it in love. I want to keep it open for anything that anybody else wants to ask or discuss, but just by way of closing my remarks, I started this evening with a quote from Pope Francis, and I'd like to end with a quote from another of my heroes, Mr. Rogers, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. Fred Rogers said this in one of his, I think this was from a commencement address someplace or other. We're talking about relationships. Mutual, caring relationships, Mr. Rogers said, require kindness and patience, tolerance, optimism, joy in the other's achievements, confidence in oneself, and the ability to give without undue thought of gain. Need a Lenten program for the last few weeks of Lent? There you have it. Thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. I'm certainly open. I'm certainly open to continuing the discussion if anybody has any questions or wants to make any comments or anything like that. Please. Yes.
I just wanted to add, on the anxiety issue, you were talking about insulating yourself and cutting off a lot of that negative information that you're getting. I find that also a good practice is to provide, where you can, an environment for yourself where that's just not shut off, but where there's something better going on.
Yes.
Like music is very.
Music is wonderful, yeah.
And also protecting you to the extent that you can, even small moments, or maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever day for yourself, whether you're praying, reading, or just sitting and listening to music.
One of the, yes, that's,
When I come into church, regardless, days like this when I'm here like 2 nights during Lent, a lot of times I say to myself, I don't have time to sit and do this, but when I get in here, then I find it relaxing. Always in church, I'm relaxed. And I don't usually come in here anxious again, like that once I've been settled.
you know, you make a really good point that, again, it's kind of, I wish we had kind of, more time to keep on going with stuff, but part of what we have to be able to learn to do is to be comfortable with silence and with taking a little bit of time for ourselves. Now, I'm not talking about going off the grid for 6 months. That's not what I mean. I mean a few minutes a day, whatever you can carve out for yourself, where you go, as Jesus says in the gospel, go to your room and shut the door, I mean, Jesus said it, so I guess it's okay for us to do that, right? Go to your room and shut the door, or whatever, your space, whatever, like whatever that is. You might take your dog for a walk or something like that, whatever. But to have a little bit of that quiet time daily for yourself. One of the meditation teachers that I follow and says that he reminds in his writings all the time that, we are called human beings, not human doings. We have to take the time to just be. And again, I'm not talking about going off the grid, I'm talking about, as you said, a couple of minutes, a few minutes here or there, whenever you can do it. I personally think it's helpful, in the old monastic traditions, the liturgy of the hours like at St. Vincent, for example, prayed at regular times of the day, except on like certain occasions, but regular times of the day. I think it's a good idea if you whether it's prayer or whether it's just a few minutes, that you try to carve that out at a reasonably regular time of the day. Because if you do that regularly, you start to look forward to it. You start to anticipate it. And that's always very helpful. It's always very helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other comments? Thank you very much, everybody. It was good seeing you. Good being here with you.